Welcome, and thanks for joining us. It's often said that the most sustainable building is the one that already exists. But how do we determine if and when a building is suited for renovation or adaptation? Architects, developers, city leaders, and the public are increasingly exploring these issues. And as we search for ways to confront the climate crisis, we want to enable our cities and our economies to evolve. I'm Stephanie Miller, Director of PR at HOK, and today we're going to tackle some of these big questions with my colleague David Weatherhead, Design Principal in our London studio, and Eoin Conroy, who's Country Director for the UK for developer Atenor. We encourage you to join the conversation by adding your questions in the comment section below, and we'll address as many of those as possible during this 25 to 30-minute chat. And the conversation will remain visible afterwards, and we encourage you, if you have more ideas and comments, to keep the conversation going so our entire community can engage. But let's just jump in and get started. David, approaching deep retrofit projects from an architect's perspective, what are the most important questions that designers need to ask when presented with these challenges?
Hi, Steph. Well, I don't think this is a new thing, right? So we've always refurbished buildings. I think the difference now is there's a clear mandate that we need to prioritize a circular economy approach. And what that means is we need to assess all sorts of parts of existing buildings to understand what the most conscientious development route would be. Um, if a building was listed, we wouldn't necessarily be thinking that's a new thing because we'd always assume that the building would be carefully restored, enhanced, and upgraded. But when we do have building stocks which are not as desirable or they're not listed, it puts the question is how much of the existing building should be saved at all, or how much should we be trying to save to ensure the longevity of that building? So what we found in terms of trying to develop conscientiously is we need to spend a lot more time early on in any project to assess what the right development route would be. Um, we can't make quick decisions, so we need to have data to allow us to make informed judgments on whether it's sensible, whether it's practical, whether it would inhibit long-term flexibility and adaptability, but also is it the right thing to do from a public side as well as an occupation side. So I think there's it what we found is it's a lot more complicated than it ever has been. There's a lot more data out there, and there's not a lot more analysis tools that we can use to allow us to be informed about how we can develop in a sensible manner. Um, but we're also working with clients who are putting this as the top of their agenda. We're finding clients like Atenor, who Owen is the country director for, this is part of their agenda to promote a sustainable development route. So what we're finding is where previously it would have been a lot of data from our side and showing options, now it's our clients are pushing us just as hard because they want to provide sustainable solutions because we all together understand how vital that is for our environment.
So great segue to over to you, Eoin. So as David's alluding, HOK and Atenor are collaborating on the deep retrofit of 10 Newbridge Street. And it's an office building that was originally constructed in the 1960s, and it's Atenor's first project in the UK. What attracted you to this property? And then second question, did you ever consider demolishing it? And just building new? And if so, what were your considerations that you weighed pro and con?
Okay, well, firstly, thank you for the invitation to join you guys today. Yeah, as you point out, Fleet House, as it was known, it's now, we call it 10 Newbridge Street, is Athena's first acquisition in the UK, but specifically in London. And I think our sort of approach to, the decision about the acquisition, and then subsequently what we did with it, was predicated a lot on location and what we were seeing, occupiers look for, both locationally, but also in terms of the environments that they will inhabit in a post-pandemic world where expectations on workspace have radically changed. We we looked at location first and foremost, and then we thought, the existing building, there's a consent that was in place at the point of acquisition that would have allowed us to demolish that building and construct something ground up new. But the consent was quite outdated. The world had changed, and in any event, it really didn't work with the Atenor story about renewal and about sustainability. Were we to just default to using an existing consent to demolish the building and then build something new. There was an opportunity for us to take a great existing building. Well, I say great, I mean it's out of date. It's not fit for purpose anymore, but generally a perfectly usable existing building, and to improve it, to make it better. There's a great embodied carbon story about that, but there's also a great story about regeneration, renewal, which is perfectly in line with our sustainability identity. And so when we looked at the options, we looked at what people are looking for in terms of location, in terms of product, in terms of workplace and environment, where the market was going, where policy was pushing us, but also fundamentally what sort of space people wanted to be in. And the idea of being in a space that has been revitalized, that has been renewed and made better, is appealing to a lot of occupiers and to a lot of people that use that workspace. And so it ties in with a broader direction of travel that we see in the market, and we wanted to respond to that and to service that. So yeah, we did have the opportunity to demolish. There was a consent that allowed us to do that, but I mean, some of the decision making, I have to confess, was made pre me joining Atenor, but I think it was a relatively sort of a short decision making process when we looked at the potential of using the existing building. And working with HOK and with David, we managed to come up with a scheme that takes an outdated, poor quality building, bring it to at least BREEAM excellent in terms of the base build. We're on course to achieve a workspace environment that will hit well platinum, and we're retaining 72% of the existing structure along the way. I think David might correct me. I think it's about almost 80% of the usable structure is being retained as part of that. Retrofit, and I think that's a great story. That's a great proposition to sell to the market, and that's exactly what people are looking for.
Yeah. And I think what we're looking for generally with any part of our city is to make our cities more attractive. We've got to make sure that our cities are usable, they're livable. They're not just as individual projects successful. They're doing things which allow us to understand the values of our cities, right? Making sure that they're attractive places, not to just to use or to work in, but also to kind of navigate in and around, to connect us to the things that promote our cities, right? And I think part of that is understanding that we want to encourage developments that do everything right, but it's not just a save at all costs for if it's an existing building. What we've got to do is we've got to put a lot of time and effort into understanding how that existing building works. The majority of existing buildings will have no doubt have been added to by piecemeal over time. There's questions about what it's made of, which from the outset might be obvious, but then as you dig in further, it becomes more complicated. So it's a very complicated subject. And I think what we all want is to make sure that the building that is that comes out of the process is suitable for the long term, but it's designed in a light which is different to the light that was shone maybe 10, 15 years ago. And in many ways, that means that we've got to look at our buildings and try and find why decisions were made in the past and what is different now. An example would be, for instance, the quality of the space. There's kind of perceived qualities that, for instance, a workplace could be drilled down to the BCO standards for, it needs to be this, that, and the other, and that'll allow it to be lettable, because that means it's a good quality office space. And what we're seeing in the market is maybe there's a slight recalibration of our values. So maybe what we're finding is some people are making decisions about where they work based on a sustainable strategy, which aligns to their values. We're also looking at potentially spaces which don't necessarily 100% adhere to what we think about before in terms of BCO standards, where you've got flat soffits, which seem to mean the kind of, from our point of view, lose the character of places that you're in. And mixed with that, different ways of working. But one of the fascinating parts from a kind of design part of view is what we've seen on 10 Newbridge Street is we've taken a building with a relatively low floor to floor height. It's 3.375 slab to slab, and we've made it work with the BCO standards for floor to soffit heights, and it's got great natural daylighting, which is relatively easy for us to model. But with the impending changes to the regulations for residential buildings, which require two stair cores, the question does arise: is if we are trying to provide buildings which are long-term, agile, adaptable places that people can work or live, maybe the question might be is we should be retaining, but also making sure that our buildings are adaptable. So we're not making our cities unattractive because it's full of building sites. We're making them kind of feel like they can adapt to different uses. And I think this building, for me, above any other we've kind of looked at and designed, is it starts asking the question is what's the appropriate floor to floor height for a residential and an office building, and could they be the same? And I think that's a really interesting topic for long term viability of our cities.
Yeah. I think just one thing just to mention,
Yeah.
David had touched on it, which is, there is probably an urban myth within some realms that, um, you know, refurbishing, as it's referred to, or retrofitting an existing building is easier and more cost effective than, demolishing something and building it up from the new. And I think that is, I think that's rare. I think it's actually quite unusual, and in many ways, it's more complicated, as David
Mhm.
had sort of alluded to there. It's the reconciling of modern standards and expectations with a historical design, and one of those things is the floor to ceiling heights within office space as well too. And there's a perception with some occupiers and an expectation of a certain height. But buildings back in the 1960s weren't designed necessarily to cater for that. So how do you make that work? And on 10 Newbridge Street, what was really interesting is part of the solution about achieving the floor to ceiling heights that would be acceptable to modern occupiers, um, involved a mechanical solution as well too, in terms of ventilation, which is, I guess, less common, which is a sort of an underfloor AET system, a sort of raised floor system where it's ventilated below ground rather than from the ceiling down. And so it's been a sort of a collective thought process within the design team led by HOK about how you problem solve and how you navigate these challenges of an existing building and making them fit for purpose so that they can appeal to modern occupiers and to achieve that modern positive workplace. So it's definitely I don't think it's an easier path in many ways, but I actually think that leads to innovation as well, and that leads to creativity in terms of the design approach, which offers character to the building, and it offers an identity. In a marketplace where there's lots of people trying vying for occupier attention, having an identity and a character associated with the historical building made anew, challenged to meet modern standards is actually quite an interesting journey and can help create value in other ways.
Well, one of the things I want to pick up on is this mention that you had, David, of potentially looking at uses in the future, which taps into the bigger question about how do all of the systems that are connected to a building that control the city, how do we align? And in many places, we're talking about planning, we're talking about policy issues, and this is not exclusive to London, it's a global issue. So, Owen, how can policy and planning systems help advance the industry overall and support you from the development side when you do want to undertake, as you've described, these very challenging, complex projects?
Yeah, I mean, I think policy is always a funny one. Sometimes it's too far behind, sometimes it's too far ahead, and so there's a bit of a push and a pull kind of dynamic to policy. I think in many ways, policy pushes forward the agenda. If I could just give you a small example, and I'm sort of taking London as a sort of a local example, but there are to be confirmed, but potentially pending, requirements in terms of EPC, environmental performance certification, that are coming into effect in terms of occupiers and their landlords about minimum standards that need to be achieved. I think it's EPCC coming in from 2025 for any new leases in a property, and from 2028, I think it's 2028 onwards, for any renewals of existing leases. So these buildings need to achieve a certain EPC rating just to be able to keep tenants, in situ. And where they can't do that, and in many cases, there's a lot of historical and older stock out there that just simply can't do that in an occupied building. Tenants need to move. And they need to move to those buildings which are future proof from a sustainability perspective, and they move to places like 10 Newbridge Street as their new location. So in a way, what policy has done there is it's kind of forced the agenda around the quality and the sustainability of buildings. That's good for some people because it means the people who have that stock available can benefit from a movement of tenants. It's bad for other people who have got historical stock and are going to lose tenants whilst they undertake a major capital works or renewal program just to make their buildings, up to scratch. But at a point in time, that sort of policy will drive, um, you know, the broader stock of buildings to be at a certain level of sustainability. And actually, the green credentials that we are championing and that we are promoting become the norm. So there's all, that then forces us to think about, well, what can be done further? How can we push, our unique credentials in terms of sustainability and our product to the next level that distinguishes itself from the norm, what has become the norm. Because I think, for all the talk of green premiums and sort of, green upsides, and you know, that might be fine during a period of transition where policy is pushing for change, but at a point in time, you know what we're doing, BREEAM excellent, well platinum, retention of buildings, carbon neutrality, all that things that will just become an expectation, and they won't necessarily find premium to it. It'll just be, well, if you don't provide that, you don't have a tenant. End of. And so I think there's a way there that's an example of how policy pushes the agenda forward. But equally, I would just sort of stress that sometimes there's a lack of consideration for the environment in which the policy is being received. And if I give you a case in point, policymakers will tell you that they're looking at their implementing policy for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. But at the end of the day, if you introduce a policy and you push forward a policy and you impose certain regulations on developers, designers, landlords, too early, too soon without considering what's happening in the wider environment, you potentially fall flat in your face and nothing actually gets delivered. And sometimes it's more regressive. So I think from a planning perspective and from a policy implementation perspective, what can be done is a bit of a reality check sometimes around the timing and the basis in which that policy is being introduced. The, the agenda still moves forward, but it does so in a much more balanced, regulated, and sustainable way, if that makes any sense.
And I guess tied to that, Owen, is the viability, right? So what we're seeing is clearly the policies have been set and that they are becoming the expectations, but it's the layers of things that developments have got to do now which are jeopardizing long-term sustainable development. And I think there needs to be a balanced approach, which I think the planning system currently has, but it could go further. So what we've got to make sure we do is we're not trapped within the musical chair approach that we've got a building stock and that's it. We've then just got to keep these things on life support. I think we've got to have long-term sustainable goals. We've got to make sure that our decisions that we make are for not just short-term sustainable wins, but for really like saying, is retaining, for instance, a structure of a building now and adding part new, is that better than if a building was demolished and a structure that was put up that was for 200 years, for instance? And we've got to have them conversations. And I think the system at present, I think, will clearly be focused on short-term goals, and I think that's something we need to really start bringing to the table in terms of informed decision making. With all of these things, it amounts to just more work, right? And I think this is one of the things that we're seeing in the work that we do is stage one's actually become quite it's a huge stage for us now. It used to be say it's a 5% to 8% of kind of an architectural commission. But I think what we're seeing now is more things need to be put on the table from day one, and we need that early engagement in the planning system to see what the appetite is for long-term real sustainable agenda. And all of these things come with a huge complicated matrix of things that we're not involved in from your side, about cost and viability, and making sure we can get tenants in, which is, I guess, part of the ultimate purpose from our sustainable point of view.
Yeah.
So it's kind of I think it's a really tricky point, a really tricky area. But I think, coming back to your point, retention of anything is not a cheap option. And what we've really got to think about is a real sensible and considered approach to where we want to develop. An example of that is making sure that we don't retain at all costs and then impact accessibility to buildings, for instance, right? Things like fire regulations and accessibility were very different in the 60s. And so we've got to make sure that we're not being short-sighted with our policies that are saying, let's keep X, but then realize that you're going to spend more carbon to bring that thing up to modern day standards. So there's a lot of work and a lot of in-depth analysis that needs to be done. But with developers who want to design, who want to provide products which are sustainable, I think it's a huge step forward for the whole of for everyone in our cities, because ultimately, if we can reduce build costs, if we can reduce build times, then that will help to make sure that we're not inconveniencing people when they want to live in the cities that they do.
I think just when we talk about sustainability as well, I think it's also important to remember that there are three, possibly four, but certainly three pillars of sustainability, and there's social, economic, and environmental. And so when we talk about sustainability, I think people just automatically think about environmental sustainability, green buildings, but actually there's a whole kind of cycle of things that need to be considered there, and it has to be viable, it has to be deliverable, it has to be accessible financially to people to be able to get any benefit from these buildings. There needs to be a social impact. David mentioned about accessibility for people. What's the point in keeping a building if nobody, or not nobody, but if there's portions of the community that simply just can't benefit from it because of accessibility issues, as an example, or disturbing neighbors for long periods of time due to complicated technical requirements needed to deliver and renew existing buildings. So there's it's more than just the environmental, and I think slightly going back to the policy point as well too. Implementing an environmental sustainability policy also needs to consider its impact on the social and on the environmental to be truly sustainable. And I think that's part of the design challenge as well too, is looking at that building and saying, okay, well, we need to hit that BREEAM accreditation, we need to have that level of carbon neutrality, and we need to do that. But it also needs to thread the needle in terms of making sure that whatever we produce is socially sustainable and is economically viable and deliverable, not just from a developer's perspective, but from an occupier's perspective, and from I guess from a sort of a whole life cycle perspective and an operational perspective as well.
Mm.
All right. Are you ready for some questions? Because we've got a few coming in, little rapid fire. First, from an architecture point of view, how do you prioritize integrating green space in some way in the building? And I think, Owen, it goes to what you were just saying about the social impact and the human experience of the building, not just performance. So either of you, what's the priority for green space?
Well, I think I think we've all slightly recalibrated our kind of understanding of biophilia and what we expect from our place of work, and I think that's it's been amplified by us spending more time at home, right, where we're generally within places where you would expect greenery and gardens, etc. So I think it's natural that we expect more of that in our workplace, and the benefits not only on kind of the air quality, but also just the kind of the fact that we're human beings, and we kind of, that's a natural thing that makes us thrive. What we've done on 10 Newbridge Street, for instance, is made sure that every floor of the building has planting. and that's not just to enjoy in terms of terraces, which the building has plenty of, but it's to make sure it's window boxes on every floor that we can see out and see nature, and obviously the benefits that has to kind of the local ecosystems and pollinators and all that sort of stuff. One of the interesting parts is our strategy on natural ventilation, because clearly the city still has work to do in terms of air quality. So we can't rely on natural ventilation for places of work, which we'd love to be able to do just at this moment in time. But what we can do is provide the infrastructure that allows natural ventilation to happen in the future. So when air quality hopefully is improved in our cities, but the more planting we have, the more accessible outdoor spaces, I think, is just going to encourage people to understand that their ways of working are being designed for, and the more planting we put on buildings, we can also reduce the kind of the heat map of our cities, which is a vitally important thing to do from a environmental point of view.
Yeah. Uh, I think so. In terms of prioritization, I mean,
Mm.
the as David mentioned, society in many ways is recalibrated in terms of where it places value, and open space and terrace space is, particularly in dense urban areas, is increasingly valued, and it's increasingly valued not just by the people that use the building on a day to day basis, but the occupiers, the guys that are signing the leases, or the tenants that are taking a flat. Um, you, Often it is found that they will pay a premium to have direct access to that space because they recognize the value that it brings for the well-being of their staff, but also, I think the function of workspace is evolved. It's no longer a place where, it has to evolve. I mean, we could go into a bit of a conversation about what's happening in the general commercial real estate market on a global basis about correction in values, but a lot of that correction is taking place in stock which hasn't been sort of designed with consideration to the change dynamics of workspace and how people live and practice their day-to-day jobs. And I think one of the functions of modern workspace is actually about bringing people together, in a social capacity as much as a work capacity, because it's that sort of environment that can trigger better working relationships, trust building, all those great things, promotional career progression, but also the sparking of ideas and innovation and progressing value growth within the business. There's a case in point. Um, GlaxoSmithKline, the large pharmaceutical company, have a massive campus out in West London, in sort of near Brentford, which they own, and they've been there for a long, long time. And they're actually moving, the majority of their sort of white collar functions back into the city of London and into a building that is plentiful in terms of its green space and its terrace space, because for two reasons. Number one, being more central allows them to access more talent, which is crucial to the value of that business, but also having spaces which allows people to interact and socialize more is part of that innovation, that productivity drive that they're trying to extrapolate from this new working practice sort of environment that we find ourselves in. And so there's an example of a tenant who relies on innovation, relies on people, and relies on their engagement to drive value in its business, and they will pay a premium to be in the city as opposed to a campus out in West London that is costing them very little, and then floor by floor for every part of the building that it gives their staff access to green space. So I think the importance of green space, terrace space is factoring quite high on the agenda when it comes to design. And I think any leasing agent will tell you that as much of that you can incorporate into a building is a good news story from a lettability perspective, from a value perspective, and occupiers are seeing that and recognizing that in the price that they pay and where they go.
And we have an interesting question that then brings that green space kind of off and out of the building into the public realm. One of our viewers is asking, as skyscrapers and tall buildings are growing in the current urban space, would retrofitting footpaths and public spaces along buildings be taken into consideration as well?
What's
Bob?
interesting about that actually is just on 10 Newbridge Street, if I may take that as an example, is that we are Atenor is part of the Fleet Street Quarter bid, which is the business improvement district. It's a sort of a collection of businesses with a quasi statutory kind of capacity, which is covering a part of the city of London and looking at the public realm and the relationship between buildings and how that can be improved to make it a more attractive location and place to invest and to work. And one of the things that we've been working, they're working with one of the competition, which I won't mention. I wouldn't do that, but they've appointed a landscape consultant to identify parts of the public realm that can connect with buildings and create more outside space. And actually, one of the conversations we're having with them is along Bridewell Place, which is just sort of south of our building. It's quite a nondescript street, I think it's fair to say, and looking at using that pathway in front of our building and connecting it into a small kind of turning head and turning it into just even a mini pocket park, so that our building is kind of the green story of our building is kind of marrying into the actual public realm, which actually sits outside of our legal title, but is something that we will work with them on to facilitate. So it's interesting that that's a coordinated approach to public landscape, and our building is being kind of woven in that sort of form, which I think is interesting, and it makes our building more attractive. It makes it more accessible. Creates a better story for the area, better story for the staff, and I think it's something that developers and designers should be collaborating, with their peers and with those types of bodies like the Fleet Street Quarter Bid to kind of promote and accelerate as much as possible.
Yeah, but it's kind of it's more important than ever that we're prioritizing active transport. We're designing for not just people to walk, but people to kind of stop, rest, and enjoy the spaces they're in. And then the cities should be doing that. We're slowly eradicating and removing unnecessary kind of vehicles from our streets, and I think that's important. And we've got to find ways that we can discover and reconnect to the gems across our cities better. Each building can help, but if we look at them isolated, I don't think we're going to hit the big picture. We're very lucky to have one of the best cities in the world for just our amount of things that we can do before or after a traditional working day. At 10 Newbridge Street, we've got the Bridewell Theatre right next door, and I think part of our original thoughts was, how can we make this, which I didn't know about, and it's kind of one of these hidden gems. How can we get more people to come to this place because we think it's really amazing, and that was plugged into our design principles from the start. It wasn't about just the normal things that you'd expect. It was like we understood that some businesses are literally on their knees because they've seen reduction in footfall. So one thing we can do is make the footfall more enhanced. We can celebrate the things around us and kind of work together. I'm not sure where that starts in terms of kind of planning. It probably means that we have more discussions on a slightly wider periphery, which I think would be slightly different to what currently happens. But things like the Fleet Street bid are a fantastic way where you can really take a huge area of, in essence, around the Strand and just go around Fleet Street and just go, look, all these businesses, all these plots of land up for development, and rethinking about what was the centre of our publishing heritage for 300 years, and what's that going to be in the next 50 years. And I think that's what's exciting, when you can start kind of being future thinking and working together to do exactly kind of a promotion of public interest in art. Seems kind of a no-brainer for me.
Just one last point. What I think is really interesting, and I'm just taking the Fleet Street Quarter Bid and sort of the area in which 10 Newbridge Street is arriving. I think what's been really interesting about that is the collaboration and the enthusiasm of engagement between multiple different landowners and developers to try and come up with a cohesive solution for a wider area, often outside of their immediate remit, because they recognize that collaborating and working together, it's not a competition. They're not all very defensively sort of wrapping their arm around their own projects and saying, well, I'll just take care of my space. There seems to be generally a very collaborative approach, because they recognize what's good for the urban realm of the wider area is good for them, and that they want to be a part of that story. And I think that's a really, we're not relying on one developer to just come up with one cohesive solution, or even relying on the city, for example, to come up with those solutions. These are developers who are working together, putting time, money, effort, and trying to contribute what they can to ensure that we can create some sort of cohesive approach. And I think that's the sort of representative of the value that developers are seeing in integrating public realm, footpaths, connective spaces with their buildings. It's now seen as one entire fabric, not a series of pieces. And I think that's a really interesting change in mindset. I mean, I'm speaking just about this area, but I'm sure it's representative of other cities, where you have these kind of areas of regeneration happening with multiple different parties.
That seems a perfect way to wrap up. We've even gone over time. We had many other questions that unfortunately we have not been able to get to, but we will go back into the comment section. So please look for our responses to those. And thank you, Owen and David. You've given us a peek behind the curtain, I guess, and we understand not only how incredibly complex these projects are, but to your point that they are not about individual buildings, they are about creating or responding to ecosystems. And so we look forward to more comments, more questions, and thanks everyone for giving us part of your day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.